Trump Force One is a great example of where someone has converted an airliner into a private jet. But what does it mean to use an airliner this way, and is it really a good idea? Stay tuned. In some of my previous videos, I have covered the amazing stories behind some of the most iconic aircraft to have ever graced the skies. Aircraft like the DC-3, the Lockheed Constellation, and also early jets like the de Havilland Comet and of course the legendary Boeing 707. In most of those videos, I've mentioned the incredibly fast development pace that could be seen during the early days of commercial aviation. The fact that aircraft development was so quick in the 1950s and 60s meant that some early airliners were actually becoming obsolete well before they had served out their full service life. Sadly, most of those aircraft were then unceremoniously trashed to make way for newer and more modern aircraft. Now, people back then didn't really care for preserving historical relics, which they most likely just saw as nothing more than failures. But what this also meant was that if you knew where to look, some of these aircraft were going for sale for incredibly low prices. And that meant that people were soon coming up with new roles for those unwanted aircraft. Now, I've done a video on the Super Guppy, which is probably the most unusual example of this, but using an old unwanted aircraft as a private jet was far more common. One of the earliest examples of this was a Convair 880, who had originally been ordered by Delta Airlines, but was later bought by none other than Elvis Presley. He named it Lisa Marie after his daughter, and you can still see it today on display in Graceland. The thing though is, Elvis didn't buy that Convair until 1975, when it was already 14 years old. Understandably, the crazy high fuel consumption of these early jets meant that it took a while for these first private jet conversions to actually start appearing. Because even though there might be some people that could afford to buy one, very few could actually pay the fuel bills. So, unsurprisingly, purpose-built early business jets easily beat those passenger jet conversions to service in the beginning. The Learjet family was one of the earliest examples, but definitely not the first. Actually, Lockheed's Jetstar was the one that entered service first, back in 1961, and Elvis actually had one of those ones as well. The first Learjet was delivered to its debut customer in 1964. But when it came to Lockheed, they actually didn't produce any more business jets after the Jetstar. In a previous video, I explained that Lockheed didn't really have much commercial success with their airliners after the Constellation, and this bad luck seemed to have also extended to their business jets. Learjet therefore soon overtook Lockheed in the private jet market and soon became something of a household name, with some people using Learjet as a term to actually describe all private jets, kind of like the way that we say Googling for searching the internet today. Of course, there were soon plenty of other companies as well, like Gulfstream, Bombardier and Embraer entering into the market, and they are all quite successful today. But the idea of using airliners as business jets never really went away, no matter how many dedicated business jets there were out on the market. Today, there are actually several companies who will happily convert any airliner of your choice to your very own private jet if you want one. Luxwing in Israel, for example, can even convert a 747 to that role if you have some spare cash burning in your pockets. But they're not just airliner conversions out there. Boeing and Airbus will happily sell you brand new airliners as a business jet if you can afford it. Because you see, something that I think that many people don't realize is that the airlines out there rarely pay even close to the retail price for their airliners when they buy them. And the reason for that is that they usually buy dozens or even hundreds of them at a time once they go shopping. And that's kind of like a big boy buy three, pay for two kind of thing. But of course, private customers in the market for a business jet, even private jet companies like NetJets for example, will rarely buy aircraft in those kind of numbers, meaning that they will have to pay closer to the list price when they do. This also means that Boeing or Airbus will be more than happy to fulfill those kind of orders, because with those prices, their profit margins becomes much higher. This is actually why both Boeing and Airbus have dedicated departments who only cater to business jet customers. But no matter if they are bought used or straight from the manufacturer, passenger airliners are designed for, well, the airlines, and repurposing them for any other role than that comes with some very real practical implications. These include things like maintenance intervals, for example, who are built around the assumption that the aircraft will fly a certain amount of hours every year. Business jets generally fly way fewer hours annually than a passenger jet will, so the manufacturers will have to adapt that service schedule quite a bit to allow for an airliner to work as a private jet. And obviously, airliners are also designed with the assumption that their operator will have engineering staff and other ground staff at almost every airport that they operate to, and that those people have very specific equipment on hand to handle them. But by contrast, dedicated business jets are often designed in ways to minimize or simplify what needs to be done during turnarounds to enable the pilots to fill all of those roles themselves. I should say here that I'm broadly comparing dedicated business jets with single-aisle airliners here, like the Boeing 737, the Airbus A320, as well as Trump's 757. There are actually people out there who operate private 787s and other wide bodies as well, but those kind of people also tend to use a second, smaller business jet to carry the mechanics and engineers to the destination ahead of the big jet in order to get ready to service it. Yeah, that is really a thing. But it's these kind of issues that most people don't think about when we're talking about using airliners as private jets, and that brings us back to the main question of this video. How much sense does it make to operate an airliner as a business jet, instead of just using something that is designed for that very purpose? And if you end up doing that, is Trump's 757 really a good choice? Well, we'll look into that in detail after this. So what do you think so far? Does Trump's 757 make any sense? Well, I'll tell you one thing that does make sense, and that's taking good care of your online security. You see, just like business jets are specially designed to provide speed and efficiency, today's sponsor, NordVPN, is designed to simplify your digital safety work and grant you access to geo-restricted content. In fact, my team and we often actually use Nord to access news articles that we need for our research, and it's super easy since Nord allows us to virtually change our location with just a click of a button. Their cybersecurity features are really handy and easy to use, and they make it harder for cybercriminals and even governments to look over your shoulder when you're browsing the web. But what I personally use Nord for the most is gaining access to Swedish sports and TV shows from here in Spain.
Så sjukt viktigt! Grym!
I don't know what I would even do without them when it comes to watching my favorite team, Modo Hockey, playing. Nord has hundreds of servers all over the world, making the service super quick and convenient. And if you want to try it out for yourself, then go to nordvpn.com/mentor now. That will give you 4 months absolutely free when you sign up for the 2-year deal. And remember, Nord always gives you a 30-day money-back guarantee. Thank you, Nord. Now back to the video. One obvious issue with single-aisle airliners serving as private jets is their range. 737s and Airbus A320s are designed as very efficient short and medium haul aircraft, which means that they're not made for globe-trotting. But of course, flying these jets around with, let's say, 15 or 20 people instead of the standard 160 or more will definitely help with stretching the range a bit, but usually not enough. To give you an example, I once ferried a brand spanking new Boeing 737 from Seattle to Dublin, and even though we were just 3 people on board and with over 21 tons of fuel, we only managed to do that 10-hour journey because of favorable tailwinds. Otherwise, we would have had to do a fuel stop in Iceland. But of course, if you're never going to have much people on board, well, then you probably won't need a lot of room in the cargo hold either. So stuffing those holds full of auxiliary fuel tanks should not be a problem, and that's exactly what both Airbus and Boeing are doing to the business jet versions of their aircraft. Now, airlines might sometimes also opt to have 1 or 2 of these tanks, depending on the aircraft model and what kind of routes that they want to fly with them. But for the business jet versions, Airbus can fit as many as 5 auxiliary center tanks in their corporate A319s or 320s, while Boeing can fit up to 9 smaller auxiliary belly tanks in its business jet 737s. Doing that obviously fixes the fuel capacity issue, with Boeing claiming that its latest MAX 7 BBJ has a range to over 6,000 nautical miles, and as a comparison, a normal MAX 7 has a range of around 3,800 nautical miles. But what about efficiency or fuel consumption if we compare these aircraft with dedicated business jets? Well, here the size of the bigger jets is obviously working against them. Since the airliners punch a much bigger hole in the sky and are also substantially heavier, they will burn a lot more fuel than their sleeker cousins will. Now, Boeing in particular claims that when you factor in maintenance costs, their latest 737 MAX BBJ family is very close to or even cheaper to use than some other large purpose-built business jets are. And they claim that that's mainly thanks to longer service intervals and the fact that there are many more service centers out there who are equipped to handle 737s than those working on business jets. But of course, this is still up for debate. It all depends a lot on how much these jets are being used, how high the parking fees are at the airports that they stay, and a lot more as well. But there is also another characteristic that's worth talking about here, and that's speed. You see, the wings of dedicated business jets are typically swept a bit more than those of short and medium haul jets, and that's done to optimize them for higher cruise speeds. The Airbus A320s, Boeing 737s and 757s all have wings with about a 25-degree sweep, which explains why they all have very similar economy cruise speeds. But the higher wing sweeps, as well as a range of other design features, makes the dedicated private jets much faster than that. Plus, they can also almost always fly at much higher altitudes, which also increases their speed. Obviously, wing sweep isn't something that the aircraft manufacturers can fix when they decide to reconfigure these aircraft to business jets, but there are some other non-speed related optimizations that they can do. One of those things is the cabin pressurization, which is often changed and upgraded in these conversions. In a normal 737 flying at its max cruise altitude of 41,000 feet, the cabin altitude which the passengers and crew will experience will be around 8,000 feet. And in general, the lower the cabin altitude is, the more comfortable the trip will be, especially if it's a long one. That's why newer long-haul airliners like the Boeing 787 have a lower cabin altitude as one of the selling features, and many large business jets have similarly low cabin altitudes of around 6,500 feet or so. Now, normally in the passenger version of the 737 we can't control the cabin altitude directly, well, unless we go to manual mode of course, and in auto mode it adjusts itself based on our cruising altitude. But Boeing has reprogrammed the automatic pressurization system on the 737 BBJs so that they also maintain a 6,500 foot cabin altitude at 41,000 feet. Now, that might lead you to ask, well, why don't they just do that for us in the traveling public as well? Well, the reason Boeing won't do this for the airlines is because it will have a significant negative effect on the number of pressure cycles, which are takeoffs and landings, that the plane will be able to do over its lifetime. And of course, for an airline, that will be really bad. Airlines and lessors don't like to abuse their jets any more than necessary, since their resale value is a key factor in the airlines or the lessor's strategy when they're buying them. But for a private jet or a business jet, things are a little bit different. Because unlike a passenger jet, which could fly several thousand hours per year, a corporate jet will fly only a few hundred hours at the most, and that's even if it's owned by a business jet company. So adjusting its differential pressure to allow for more comfortable cabin altitude won't really begin to have any effect until the plane is already so old and unmodern that people don't want to fly in it anyway. So with all of that in mind, let's look at the 757 that Donald Trump is using. Today this aircraft is 32 years old, and it first entered service in 1991 as an airliner with a Danish operator called Sterling Airways. That company fell on hard times and it went bankrupt in 1993. They would later reorganize and relaunch, this time as Sterling Airlines, but with a much smaller fleet, and that's when this aircraft changed hands. So this meant that Trump didn't get this plane new from Boeing, and he wasn't even the first person to use it as a business jet. Instead, the first corporate user of this 757 was actually Paul Allen, the co-founder of Microsoft, who also was a huge aviation buff. He sadly passed away in 2018. Paul Allen was the one who originally converted this aircraft into its VIP configuration, and he did so when it was less than 2 years old. He then used it from 1995 for around 15 years, and in his ownership the plane had a rather more subdued livery and the registration November 757 Alpha Fox. And by the way, take a close look at this photo. Do you see anything unusual here? Something that you very rarely see on a 757? Well, we'll get back to that. Trump picked up the 757 in 2010 and then started using it in 2011 after remodeling the interior and, of course, changing the livery. When Trump bought it, the jet was already around 20 years old and he didn't change the plane's registration. Up until that point, Trump's main aircraft had been a Boeing 727-100 with the same dark livery as the current 757 now is using. The original operator of that old jet was American Airlines, and curiously, that aircraft had a Bermuda registration, Victor Papa/Bravo Delta Juliet. In the early 1990s, it had formed part of an airline called Trump Shuttle, which you might have heard of.
I will wait for you and have a good flight.
And in case you haven't, Trump Shuttle was an airline that Trump tried to run for a couple of years, from 1989 to 1992. And his idea was that it should be operated as a luxury shuttle between New York, Boston and Washington, D.C. That turned out to not go very well at all, and when it went bankrupt, its assets were later picked up by US Airways and after that American Airlines, except for the 727. So that was a little bit of a history lesson for you, but how does Trump's 757 compare as a business jet to other airliner designs? Well, this might not come as a big surprise to you, but not great in terms of efficiency. It's likely an improvement over the previous 727 though. If we compare it with more contemporary aircraft, the 757 isn't, for example, as efficient as the 737 or Airbus A320, at least not as a business jet. Now, we pilots tend to love flying the 757, and that's because it has plenty of excess thrust, enabling it to operate comfortably in really difficult conditions like airports in hot climates or in high altitudes, or even a combination of the two. But in its role as a business jet, that advantage really isn't that relevant. And that's because when the aircraft is carrying, let's say, 15 or 20 people instead of 160, any of those other airliners would have plenty of excess performance as well. But the 757 is a much heavier aircraft than those other ones, and together with those powerful engines, it means that it burns a lot more fuel. In terms of room in the cabin, well, the 757-200 is of course a longer aircraft. It's basically similar to an Airbus A321, but in terms of cabin width, which defines the size of the rooms that you can fit into the aircraft, the 757 is basically the same as the 737, or Trump's older 727 for that matter. And it's actually even a bit narrower than the Airbus 320 family. Here, it's also worth comparing the 757 with the 737 in one other respect, its height off the ground. You see, one of the peculiarities of the 737 is that its fuselage sits quite low and close to the ground, which is a feature that it basically inherited from the 727 who preceded it. The idea behind that was that back in the 1960s, smaller airports had limited ground handling infrastructure, so Boeing thought that it would be a great idea to keep the planes as low as possible. This would ease the loading and unloading of luggage, plus it made it easier to fit built-in air stairs in the aircraft to help them operate without mobile steps. But this closeness to the ground was also what made it harder to stretch and for new, bigger engines to be fitted to later 737s. Fast forward a few decades, and today most airlines don't use built-in air stairs anyway, even if they don't always use jetways. The built-in air stairs obviously add weight to the aircraft, but not as much as they would if the plane was higher off the ground, like a 757 for example. That's why some 737s still have those air stairs despite the weight penalty. Well, that and the fact that the air stairs actually form part of the original weight and balance calculations, so removing them would mean adding ballast instead. But anyway, Airbus actually designed the Airbus A320 family with built-in air stairs as an option, but no airline ever ordered them, at least as far as I know. So what about the 757 then? Well, Boeing had learned its lesson by then and really made sure that that plane was as nice and tall off the ground as possible. Now, even though they did that, they never actually gave it any bigger engines than the original ones to make use of that height, but the plane's tall legs made it easier to extend its fuselage when Boeing eventually launched the longer 757-300, and personally, I've always thought that that look is completely stunning. It looks like a bird of prey. Anyway, the point I want to get to here is that when you want to use an airliner as a business jet, you actually want it to be low, not high, and that's for the same reason as I mentioned before. Easier loading of baggage, servicing by engineers and fuelers, etc. So with that in mind, let's have another look at that picture of Trump's 757 when it was still Paul Allen's plane. Notice that it has some really tall and narrow air stairs on the front left door. You can also see a ladder just to the right of those air stairs, probably someone trying to access the front hold cargo door on the other side of the aircraft. There were no 757s ever sold with air stairs, but they could have easily been added on to make life easier for crews. Now we know that Trump kept those air stairs installed, but I would guess that he doesn't use them very often, at least not in public, because they don't look very cool. Also, these aftermarket air stairs take up quite a lot of room inside of the cabin, and they often make it impossible to use that door with mobile stairs or even with a jetway. That probably explains why on public events you often see Trump boarding or exiting his plane from the rear door or even on the right side of the aircraft. Now we don't know if it was possible to make other changes to this 757 to optimize it as a business jet, like lowering its cabin altitude for example. But we do know that there are other specialty 757s, like the military's C-32s from the US Air Force for example. Now, Trump sometimes did use these smaller planes as his Air Force One when the 747s weren't available, and this was a little bit ironic because during his time as a president, Trump couldn't use his own 757 for security reasons. But to summarize this, a Boeing 757 needs a larger parking space than a 737 or Airbus A320 because it has a larger wingspan than those jets, meaning that the parking and landing fees will be higher. That, plus the higher fuel burn, plus the more expensive maintenance, probably doesn't make it a great choice as a business jet. For someone who really needs that much cabin length, an Airbus A321 would be a much better choice, even though I can see why an American president might have some issues with that. Now, despite being 32 years old, Trump's 757 is probably in quite good condition, assuming that the maintenance has been okay. It only flew as an airliner for 2 years, so it should have very few hours on its back. But the size and type still make it super pricey to operate and even to keep parked, but that's likely not the main priority for Trump. The fact that it's just gorgeous looking is likely far more important. What do you think? I'd love to hear what you think in the comments below. Now if you want to see another super cool video, then check this out or this playlist. If you want to support the work that me and my team does, then consider becoming part of my wonderful Patreon crew. Buy a t-shirt or send a super thanks. It's hugely appreciated. Have an absolutely fantastic day and I'll see you next time. Bye bye.